There is a memory that exists nowhere except in the minds of the people who were in that room. A young woman named Claire Whitfield presses her palm flat against a pane of reinforced glass, and on the other side, a toddler she has never once been allowed to hold presses her own small hand back. Claire is 28. She has already spent 3 years in federal prison for a crime built almost entirely out of her own name on a spreadsheet, with 3 more years left to serve. What almost no one knows, including the man responsible for putting her there, is that this is not the end of her story. It is barely the beginning. Somewhere else, in a glass office 40 floors above a city that never sees his exhaustion, a man named Richard Calloway is about to spend a fortune trying to find her. He will call it conscience. What he will not say out loud is that he does not need her forgiveness. He needs something only she still has, something that could save everything he built, or end it. And he has no idea that the reason he needs her most is a daughter he has never met, growing up 3 states away, under a name he doesn't recognize. So here is the only question that matters. If the man who destroyed your life came back needing something from you, what would you do with that kind of power? To understand how any of this became possible, you need to know 3 things, and for now, that's all you're going to get. A woman was convicted of a crime tied to millions of dollars in missing shipping contracts, and the evidence against her was thinner than anyone in that courtroom wanted to admit. A husband, sitting in the gallery every single day of that trial, was never questioned, let alone charged, even though he was the one person who could have ended it with 2 honest sentences. And somewhere between the verdict and today, a child was born who has spent her entire life believing her father was gone, while her mother spent every one of those years building something her father never saw coming. That is the shape of this story. Why did Claire Whitfield go down so fast for a crime she says she didn't commit? What does Richard Calloway actually need from her now? Badly enough to hire people to find a woman who changed her own name just to disappear. And what has she been quietly preparing for, all these years, that he has absolutely no idea exists? We are going to walk through every single piece of it, from the marriage that started this, to the trial that buried her, to the exact moment, happening right now, when the man who destroyed her life is finally about to find her again, and discover just how much he underestimated the woman he left behind. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand Claire Whitfield, you have to understand that she was never the reckless one. She was the person other people trusted, precisely because she was careful, methodical, the kind of employee who caught errors before anyone else even noticed there was a document to check. At 26, she had built the entire reconciliation system that Calloway Logistics still used to track its vendor payments. A system so clean that auditors from outside the company routinely praised it as a model for the industry. She was ambitious in the quiet way that gets overlooked in rooms full of louder people, and she had earned every promotion she ever received. None of that would matter, in the end, nearly as much as who she happened to be married to. Richard Calloway was the company's ambitious chief operating officer when he and Claire met, a man carrying the particular weight of being the founder's only son. His father, Walter Calloway, had built the company from 3 trucks into a national logistics operation, and he made no secret of his doubts that Richard could ever run it the same way. Richard courted Claire the way he did most things in his life, with charm calibrated to the exact right pressure, and for the first several years of their marriage, the affection between them was genuine. This detail matters, because everything that follows only works as a tragedy if you understand that Claire did not marry a monster. She married a man who would eventually make a coward's choice under pressure, which is a much more ordinary and much more devastating kind of story. The first thread of what would eventually unravel everything began quietly, the way most of these stories do. Early in their marriage, Richard asked Claire to keep a particular vendor account off her radar, framing it as a small favor tied to an old arrangement of his father's that he didn't want complicated by her usual level of scrutiny. Claire agreed without pushing further, the same way any spouse might agree to stay out of a partner's family business. It is easy, looking backward, to call this the moment everything changed. It wasn't. It was simply the first domino, indistinguishable at the time from 100 other ordinary requests inside a marriage built on trust. Neither of them had any reason yet to question. The pressure on Richard, meanwhile, was not invisible to anyone who worked closely with him. Walter Calloway was dying slowly of a heart condition he refused to discuss publicly, and he had made it plain to the board, and eventually to Richard directly, that the company would not pass fully into his son's hands unless Richard proved he could run it without what Walter called his father's people cleaning up behind him. Richard heard that sentence more than once in the final years of Walter's life, and it shaped nearly every decision he made afterward, including the one that would eventually cost his wife a decade of her life. None of this excuses what came next. It simply explains why a man who did not consider himself cruel would go on to do something unforgivable. Roughly a year before her arrest, Claire noticed something that didn't sit right inside the very account Richard had once asked her to leave alone. A transfer had been routed through a vendor she did not recognize, dressed up in paperwork that looked correct on its surface, but didn't match anything she remembered approving. She raised it with Richard privately, the way she had raised smaller discrepancies dozens of times before in her career, expecting the same outcome she always got, a quick explanation and a closed loop. Richard told her he would handle it personally, and asked her, gently, not to mention it to anyone else, until he had a chance to sort it out with the vendor directly. Claire, trusting the man she had built a life with, let it go. She also mentioned the same discrepancy, almost in passing, to a compliance officer 2 levels below her, a decision she would later think about more than almost any other choice she made that year. The officer told her it was above her pay grade and that Richard, as chief operating officer, was the correct person to handle it through proper channels. It is worth sitting with that response for a moment, because it means at least 2 people inside that company had the chance to stop what happened before it ever became a criminal case, and neither of them did. This is not a story about one bad man acting alone. It is a story about how easily an entire system can let a single voice go unheard, simply because raising it again felt like more trouble than it was worth. What almost no one around Claire knew, not even Claire herself yet, was that she was newly pregnant in those final weeks before everything collapsed, early enough along that there had been no symptoms she'd have thought to question. She would not learn this fact from a doctor she trusted, in a room she chose, surrounded by people who loved her. She would learn it from a stranger doing routine paperwork, in circumstances designed to strip away every ounce of dignity a mother is supposed to be allowed when she first hears that kind of news. Within 3 weeks of that conversation about the vendor account, federal auditors would be seizing Claire's work laptop directly from her desk, and Richard would be the one who quietly suggested to investigators exactly where to start looking first. The audit that followed was not sloppy, and that detail matters more than people usually give it credit for. An outside contractor, brought in for a routine annual review, was the one who first flagged the missing funds, which meant Richard never had to appear as the person who raised the alarm on his own company. The paper trail that emerged was genuinely confusing, layered enough that a jury could believe more than one version of events, because the shell vendor at the center of it existed on paper without performing any real work, and the invoices approving its payments had been routed through the very reconciliation system Claire herself had designed. A careful person looking at that evidence honestly could see it 2 ways: as something Richard built deliberately from the start, or as a vulnerability he simply chose to exploit once someone else discovered it. Only Richard ever knew which one was true. The contractor's initial findings were narrow, flagging only a pattern of irregular payments without naming any individual as responsible, which meant the earliest days of the audit were still, in theory, survivable for everyone involved if someone had simply told the truth at that point. Richard sat through 2 separate meetings with the outside auditors during that first week, watching the scope of their questions slowly narrow toward the reconciliation system and, inevitably, toward the one employee who understood that system better than anyone else at the company. He said nothing in either meeting that was technically false. He simply said nothing at all about the conversation he'd had with Claire months earlier, a silence that would prove far more damaging than any lie could have been. What happened next, in a locked office on a floor no one else was working that late, is the moment this entire story pivots around, even though almost nobody who worked at Calloway Logistics ever knew it occurred. Richard sat alone with the auditor's preliminary findings spread across his desk, understanding exactly what those numbers would look like once someone connected them to his wife's name and her access to the system, and understanding just as clearly what they would look like if he told the truth about who had actually authorized the transfer. He made a phone call that night to Adrian Voss, the company's outside counsel at the time, a call the narrator can only describe by its outcome rather than its content, because by morning, Richard had retained separate legal representation for himself and had said nothing at all to Claire about what he now knew was coming. The arrest happened at their home, in front of neighbors who would later describe the scene to reporters with a strange mixture of sympathy and fascination. Richard stood in the doorway as agents led Claire out in handcuffs, and he performed shock convincingly enough that colleagues who witnessed it would later testify, without any apparent doubt, to how devastated he had seemed. His last words to her before 10 years of her life were taken from her were 4 words that would come to define everything that followed. "I'll fix this," he told her, and then he did not. Claire would spend the coming decade discovering exactly how far a person can stretch the meaning of that sentence when they never actually intend to keep it. Within the week, sitting in a county jail cell with nothing to occupy her but the sound of other women's conversations she wasn't part of, Claire learned from a nurse conducting routine medical intake that she was roughly 8 weeks pregnant. She had no one beside her to hear that news with her, no partner's hand to hold, no mother in the waiting room. She had only the fluorescent lights and a stranger reading a chart aloud, and the sudden, overwhelming understanding that whatever came next in this legal fight, she was no longer only fighting it for herself. Prosecutors offered Claire a plea deal early in the process, one that would have required her to name a co-conspirator who did not exist, in exchange for a reduced sentence and an earlier release. Her lawyer, a tired but competent public defender named Grace Alonzo, warned her plainly that a trial was a gamble few defendants in her position ever won. Claire refused the deal anyway, unwilling to build her freedom on a lie about someone who had never done anything wrong, even as every rational calculation told her that refusing was likely to cost her years she would never get back. This is the moment worth remembering above almost every other in this story, because it is the first clear proof of exactly who Claire Whitfield really was, underneath everything that had been done to her. She was frightened, and she refused to lie anyway. The trial itself unfolded less like a single dramatic confrontation, and more like a slow accumulation of small, procedural cruelties, each one landing quieter than the last but leaving deeper marks. The prosecution's financial expert built an entire narrative around the reconciliation system Claire had designed years earlier, using her own competence as the clearest evidence of her guilt, since no one else in the company understood that system as intimately as she did. Richard testified as a supportive, visibly shaken husband, coached carefully beforehand to answer only the exact questions he was asked and volunteer nothing about the earlier conversation regarding the vendor account. The single honest sentence that could have changed everything sat in his mouth for the entire trial, and he never once let it out. Grace Alonzo, Claire's public defender, fought harder for her than the county's caseload usually allowed any single client, cross-examining the financial expert for nearly 2 full days and picking apart the timeline wherever it seemed thin enough to break. She never had the resources to hire her own forensic accountant, a detail that would matter enormously years later, once Claire understood exactly how differently that trial might have gone, with proper funding behind her defense. Grace believed her client, quietly and without ever saying so directly in front of the jury, and that belief would stay with her long after the verdict, becoming one more thread in the story that eventually pulled everything back into the light. Claire's older sister, Dana Whitfield, sat in that courtroom gallery every single day of the trial, taking notes on a legal pad she still has to this day, sensing early on that the case against her sister was thinner than the eventual verdict would suggest. Dana began, quietly and on her own initiative, saving copies of every document the defense received in discovery, telling no one, not even Claire, exactly why she felt the need to do it. It was, at the time, simply instinct. It would become, years later, one of the most important decisions anyone made in this entire story. The verdict, when it came, was read without theater, in the flat procedural language courts use for the most life-altering sentences imaginable. Claire's hand tightened on the defense table hard enough to leave marks in her own skin, and across the room, Richard's eyes did not quite meet hers as the word guilty was read aloud. No one in that courtroom yet knew that Claire was carrying a child, including Claire herself only weeks earlier. And the cruelest irony of that morning is that the two facts, the verdict and the pregnancy, would remain forever tangled together in the story of a family that had not yet finished falling apart. Claire was sentenced to 10 years, a number that landed on her like a physical weight in a courtroom that had already taken nearly everything else it could take. Richard visited her exactly once during her first month of incarceration, sitting across a table from her and telling her, in the same tone he had used the night of her arrest, that he was still sorting things out and that she shouldn't worry. He never returned after that visit. From inside prison, weighing the risk of what information could be turned into leverage against her, Claire made the deliberate decision to keep her pregnancy entirely from Richard, choosing silence not out of shame, but out of the calculated understanding that her unborn child's existence was the one thing left in her life that Richard did not get to control. Claire gave birth under supervised custody, in circumstances no mother should ever have to endure, and her sister Dana stepped forward immediately to take legal guardianship rather than let the baby enter foster care. Dana had been planning to start graduate school that same year, a plan she quietly abandoned without complaint, reshaping her entire life around raising a niece she loved as fiercely as if she'd been her own daughter from the very beginning. The baby was named Josephine, and from her earliest years, she called Dana by a name closer to mother than aunt, even as Dana made sure, gently and consistently, that Josephine always knew the truth about who had given birth to her. Rather than let her sentence break her, Claire made a decision early in her incarceration that would define the entire second half of this story. She enrolled in every educational program the prison offered, completed a paralegal certification within her first 2 years, and became, by the accounts of nearly everyone who worked in that facility's law library, its most capable unofficial resource. She began submitting quiet, patient requests for public records tied to her own case, telling no one why, building what would eventually become a private archive assembled one document at a time across nearly a decade. Midway through her sentence, Claire formed an unlikely friendship with a fellow inmate named Renata Cole, a former corporate bookkeeper serving time for an unrelated fraud, who recognized the shape of Claire's case the moment Claire described it to her in the prison yard one afternoon. Renata became something between a mentor and a friend, teaching Claire exactly how shell vendor schemes are typically constructed, and more importantly, what kind of internal email trail almost always survives somewhere, even when a company believes every trace of it has been erased. That friendship gave Claire something rare inside those walls, a genuine human connection built on mutual respect, rather than survival alone, and it gave her investigation a real foundation, rather than simple intuition. The two women spent countless evenings in the library, going over the mechanics of exactly how a company the size of Calloway Logistics might route money through an account that looked legitimate on paper but performed no actual work, and Renata was clear with Claire from the start that these schemes rarely leave a completely clean trail, no matter how carefully someone tries to cover it. Somewhere, Renata told her, there is almost always a single authorization, a moment where someone with real power had to put their name on something in writing, because even the most careful executives eventually need a paper trail their own accountants can follow. That single piece of advice would end up shaping nearly a decade of Claire's patient, methodical search once she began submitting her own records requests. Outside prison, a retired detective named Marion Ruiz found herself returning to Claire's case file more than once over the years, without ever quite admitting to herself why. Ruiz had worked the original investigation and had always felt, somewhere beneath the professional confidence required to close a case, that things had moved faster and cleaner than the actual evidence justified. She remembered, specifically, how quickly the case had been handed off once Richard's name stopped coming up in any of the follow-up interviews, a detail that had nagged at her long after the department considered the matter closed. She never voiced that doubt publicly, and she never reopened anything officially, but she kept a copy of the file long after she had any professional reason to, the way certain cases simply refuse to let a good investigator fully walk away. While Claire built her quiet archive one document at a time, Richard's life outside those walls moved in the opposite direction entirely. His father died 2 years into Claire's sentence, and Richard inherited full control of the company he had spent his entire adult life trying to prove he deserved. He pursued an aggressive period of expansion that tripled the company's revenue within 5 years, earning him admiration from a board that had once doubted him and a reputation in the industry as a visionary who had rebuilt his family's legacy from the ground up. The shell vendor scheme at the center of Claire's original conviction was never actually resolved during any of this. It was simply buried deeper, restructured under new vendor names by Adrian Voss, now Richard's general counsel, to keep it a step ahead of the routine audits that came with running a much larger, much more scrutinized company. Richard rarely spoke of his wife publicly during those years, and when he was occasionally asked in interviews about his personal life, he offered only brief, practiced statements about a difficult chapter that was now behind him, careful never to elaborate further. Colleagues who worked closely with him during this period would later describe a man who seemed to genuinely believe his own account of events, someone who had built an entire narrative in his own mind, where he was simply an unlucky bystander rather than the person who had chosen, deliberately, to let an innocent woman take the fall for his own decision. This is often how these stories work in real life. The people responsible rarely see themselves clearly, and the longer the silence holds, the easier it becomes to believe their own version of it. Josephine grew up in Dana's house, 3 states away from where any of this had happened, a childhood full of ordinary moments that carried an unspoken weight underneath them. There was a school play where she scanned the audience for a father she'd never met, a bedtime conversation where she asked Dana, plainly, why she didn't have a dad the way other kids at school did. Dana answered carefully every time, telling Josephine only that her father wasn't able to be there, a version of the truth chosen to protect a child too young, yet to understand the fuller story. Josephine grew into a perceptive, slightly guarded teenager who had long since sensed that something about her family's history didn't fully add up, even without anyone telling her exactly what that something was. Claire's visits during Josephine's early years were limited by distance and by the careful boundaries Dana had put in place to protect a routine that was already working for a child who needed stability more than anything else. Every visit Claire was allowed, she showed up with the same quiet determination she brought to everything else in her life, building a relationship in small, patient increments, rather than trying to force back all at once what a decade had taken from both of them. By the time Josephine was old enough to understand more of the truth, she already knew her mother as someone steady and present, even if the reasons behind their unusual arrangement remained, for years, only partly explained. In the 8th year of her sentence, Claire's patient records requests finally surfaced something Richard had believed no longer existed anywhere: an internal email authorizing the exact transfer she had been convicted of executing, sent directly from Richard's own account 2 days before her arrest. She copied the document quietly before anyone realized what she had found, and in the final months before Renata's own release, she asked her friend to carry a second copy out with her as a safeguard, unwilling to let a single point of failure put a decade of patient work at risk. Finding that email did not immediately change anything about Claire's circumstances, and it's worth being honest about that rather than treating the discovery as an instant turning point. She still had 2 more years left to serve, still had to decide, carefully and without rushing, exactly how and when this information should ever be used, and still had no guarantee that a single email, however damning, would be enough on its own to undo a jury verdict that had already stood for the better part of a decade. What that discovery gave her instead was something quieter and, in the end, more valuable than an immediate legal remedy. It gave her certainty. For the first time since her arrest, she was no longer simply hoping the truth existed somewhere. She was holding it. Claire was released 14 months early for good behavior, and the moment carried none of the vindication people often imagine when they picture a wrongfully convicted person finally walking free. There was no crowd waiting for her, no press conference, only Dana standing in a parking lot beside a car with a child's booster seat still folded in the trunk from years earlier, and a 6-year-old girl who had never met her own mother meeting her for the first time as a careful, curious stranger who happened to share her sister's eyes. It would take years for Claire and Josephine to build something resembling the relationship a decade of separation had stolen from both of them, and that slow, quiet rebuilding became its own kind of victory, separate from anything that would eventually happen with Richard. The years immediately following Claire's release were, by her own later account, harder in some ways than her time inside had been. She had to build an entirely new identity from nothing, legally changing her name to Claire Dawson, to avoid the reporters and curious strangers who occasionally recognized her from old news coverage, finding work that didn't require explaining a gap of nearly a decade on her resume, and slowly, patiently earning the kind of trust from Josephine that couldn't simply be requested or rushed. She used the paralegal certification she'd earned inside prison to find steady work at a small firm 3 states away from everything that had happened to her, close enough to see Josephine grow up, and far enough that no one asked questions she wasn't ready to answer. The present day catches up with this story through an entirely different door than the one that closed on Claire 10 years earlier. A new whistleblower inside Calloway Logistics, someone with no knowledge of the company's history and no connection to Claire whatsoever, triggers a fresh federal audit that traces the exact same shell vendor pattern from a decade earlier, now grown into a liability far larger than anything Richard originally hid. Adrian Voss, still serving as general counsel, and still carrying the quiet weight of a decision he made as a young associate all those years ago, realizes almost immediately that the only documentation capable of proving these transfers were ever properly authorized existed solely on a laptop seized as evidence during Claire's original trial, a laptop the court system has since lost track of entirely. The whistleblower in question was a junior compliance analyst who had noticed the same kind of pattern Claire once flagged years earlier, an oddly structured vendor account that didn't match the volume of work it claimed to represent. Unlike Claire, this analyst had no personal stake in the outcome and no reason to stay quiet about it, and the report she filed moved through regulatory channels with a speed the original irregularity never received a decade earlier. It is a small, almost unbearable irony sitting at the center of this entire second act, that the very kind of honest observation Claire made years before her arrest is the exact thing that finally brings this whole story back into the light, just coming from someone else entirely, this time with nothing left to lose by speaking up. Richard's public search for Claire begins shortly afterward, framed carefully for the press as a long overdue attempt to make amends with the woman his company's legal troubles once cost so dearly. Privately, it has nothing to do with amends at all. He needs a witness who can either exonerate the company's current filings or bury them completely, and he has convinced himself, the same way he convinced himself a decade earlier, that finding her quickly is simply a practical necessity rather than anything resembling guilt. Adrian Voss finds himself, for the first time in 10 years, genuinely uneasy about where this search might lead. He is the one who has to deliver the news to Richard that the original documents are unrecoverable, and he is also, quietly and without telling anyone, the one who begins researching Claire's life after her release on his own time, unsettled by how conveniently this entire situation would resolve itself for the company if a woman with her history simply couldn't be found. For a stretch of this story, it remains genuinely unclear whether Adrian will help Richard locate Claire in order to use her, or whether his own long-buried conscience will finally push him to warn her first. Adrian had been a young, ambitious associate at the time of Claire's original trial, present in the room the night Richard made that first fateful phone call, and he had spent the decade since telling himself that the legal system, not any individual person, had been responsible for whatever happened to Claire Whitfield. That rationalization had held up reasonably well for 10 years, right up until the moment he found himself staring at old case files with fresh eyes, forced to reckon with exactly how much he had personally helped construct the version of events that kept Richard's name out of every filing connected to the case. It is one thing to tell yourself a lie for a decade. It is another thing entirely to be handed fresh evidence that the lie was never true in the first place. What none of them yet understand is that Claire has not spent the last several years hiding from Richard so much as quietly watching him. Dana kept a folder of press clippings, tracking the company's growth for years, without ever fully explaining why, and Claire herself, using public library computers under her legally changed name, followed the company's stock filings and board announcements closely enough to understand almost everything happening inside Calloway Logistics, from the outside looking in. When Richard's private investigator finally gets close enough to locate her, Claire is not caught off guard in the slightest. She has already anticipated this exact moment for longer than Richard could possibly imagine. Around this same time, Renata Cole, now working legitimately as a compliance consultant after her own release, notices Calloway Logistics named in a new regulatory filing and immediately understands what that means. She reaches out to Claire for the first time in years and returns the second copy of the authorization email she has safely kept ever since walking out of prison, a promise she made and never once considered breaking. This single moment rewards everything Claire built inside those walls, proving that the relationships and knowledge she cultivated during her sentence were never simply about surviving it, but about preparing for exactly this outcome. The meeting between Claire and Richard, when it finally happens, is not an accident. Claire arranges it deliberately, on her own terms, in a public place of her choosing, refusing to give Richard even the smallest illusion of control over how this conversation unfolds. She tells him calmly, without raising her voice even once, that she still has the original authorization email, proving exactly what he did a decade earlier. She does not threaten him, and she does not need to. She simply lets him sit with the full understanding of what she is now capable of proving, and watches him understand, in real time, exactly how badly he has misjudged the woman sitting across from him. Richard, by his own account later, had spent weeks imagining how this conversation might go, rehearsing apologies and explanations he assumed she would need to hear before agreeing to anything. None of that preparation mattered once he was actually sitting across from her. Claire did not want an apology, and she made that clear almost immediately, telling him plainly that whatever he had spent a decade telling himself about that night, none of it changed what actually happened, and none of it was going to be the thing that decided what happened next. For a man who had spent 10 years controlling nearly every outcome in his professional life, the experience of sitting across from someone who simply would not be managed seemed to unsettle him more than any accusation could have. Before that meeting ends, Richard makes one final attempt to regain the kind of control that has defined his entire adult life, offering Claire a significant sum of money in exchange for the document and her permanent silence, treating this crisis exactly the way he treated the original one, a decade earlier, as something that could simply be made to disappear with enough resources applied to it. Claire refuses without hesitation, and her refusal, delivered quietly rather than with any anger at all, becomes the clearest possible evidence of just how completely she has changed in the years since he last had any power over her decisions. What Richard does not yet know, sitting across from the woman he destroyed and rebuilt his entire company on top of, is that there is one more piece of information Claire has been carrying this entire time, one that has nothing to do with authorization emails or federal audits at all. She tells him, in the same steady voice she has used throughout their entire conversation, that he has a daughter, 16 years old now, who has spent her whole life believing her father was dead. The narrator gives this moment the space it deserves, because it is the true emotional center of everything that has happened across this entire story, and Richard's reaction is neither villainous nor redemptive in that instant, simply the reaction of a man confronted all at once with the full scale of what his silence actually cost. He asked her, according to Claire's later account of the conversation, only one question in the minutes that followed, wanting to know why she had never told him, even after everything. Claire's answer was simple and unhurried, the same steady tone she had carried through the entire exchange. She told him that the moment she learned she was pregnant, alone, with no one beside her, she made a decision that her child would never become a bargaining chip in whatever came next between them, and that keeping that secret was the one thing left in her life a jury and a prison sentence had not been able to take away from her. Richard had no response to that. For possibly the first time in a decade, there was nothing left for him to manage or control. Josephine herself, when she eventually learns the truth, is given the same agency her mother has fought so hard to reclaim throughout this entire story. She is old enough to hold real opinions about meeting a father she was told for 16 years was gone, and she chooses, deliberately and entirely on her own timeline, whether and how to let him into her life at all, a quiet echo of her mother's own insistence on controlling the terms of every reunion that has defined this story from the very beginning. Their first conversation, when it finally happens, is short and careful on both sides, neither of them pretending that 16 years can be closed in a single afternoon, both of them simply agreeing that trying, slowly, was better than continuing not to. Rather than resolve this story through a courtroom spectacle, Claire chooses negotiation instead, offering the authorization email to federal auditors in a way that clears her own record and exposes exactly what Richard chose to do a decade earlier, while carefully structuring the disclosure so that Josephine's privacy remains protected and so that the company's collapse doesn't cost hundreds of ordinary employees their jobs in the process. It is a resolution built on precision rather than destruction, the clearest possible expression of the fearless, deliberate woman Claire had spent an entire decade becoming. Grace Alonzo, the public defender who had fought for Claire all those years earlier, with far fewer resources than the case deserved, was one of the first people Claire called once the exoneration process formally began. Grace had long since left criminal defense for a quieter civil practice, worn down by a system that rarely rewarded the cases she believed in most. And hearing from Claire after all those years gave her something she hadn't expected to feel again about a case she had never fully let go of. Claire made sure, publicly and specifically, that Grace's original defense work was acknowledged in every account of how the truth eventually came out. A small correction to a record that had never given her lawyer enough credit the first time around. Richard is not sent to prison in any kind of tidy mirror of what Claire endured, and the real accountability that eventually reaches him is professional and reputational rather than criminal. He is forced out as chief executive, faces significant regulatory penalties, and, more painfully than any of that, has to spend the following years slowly earning a relationship with a daughter who spent her entire childhood believing he simply didn't exist anymore. That lingering discomfort, rather than a clean villain's downfall, is what makes this ending feel honest rather than simply satisfying. In a quiet moment away from all of it, Claire finally tells Dana, plainly and without hesitation, exactly how much her decade of unglamorous, unrewarded loyalty meant, acknowledging out loud the sacrifice Dana had never once complained about making. Dana, never one for large gestures, simply told her sister that she would do every bit of it again without a second thought, a sentence that carried more weight between the two of them than any grand speech could have. And somewhere else entirely, a now fully retired Marian Ruiz hears the news of the case's reversal on her television one evening and allows herself, for the first time in years, to feel that the doubt she carried quietly for so long had been justified all along. Claire's life today looks nothing like the one prosecutors and a jury once decided for her. Publicly cleared of her original conviction, reunited with her sister and her daughter without any remaining secrets between them, she now uses the paralegal training she built inside prison to help other wrongfully convicted people navigate the exact same system that once failed her so completely. This story was never really about revenge, in the end. It was about what patience can quietly build when someone refuses to be erased. So here is the question worth sitting with before you go. Would you have recognized the man you married in the decisions he made when no one else was watching? And if you were Claire, holding everything she eventually held, would you have used it, or would you have simply let it go? If a story like this stayed with you, that means it did exactly what it was meant to do, and that's exactly why this channel exists in the first place. Tell us in the comments what part of Claire's story affected you the most, and if there's a piece of it you saw coming long before we revealed it. And if you want more stories built exactly like this one, waiting for you the moment they're released, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what's coming next.